This conference will now be recorded.
Okie doke. So we're going to go ahead and hop on in, and I think a few more folks will be joining us as we go, which is totally cool. Today we're going to talk about role clarity and setting boundaries. So last time we had a really rich discussion around just how people can really get confused about the peer support role, and it's really helpful to be able to have some specific techniques in terms of like being able to clarify what your role is. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. Here is our agenda. So we'll have some discussion. We'll talk about, clarifying your role and setting boundaries. We'll talk specifically on like a couple different topics with that. So one is friendship versus mutuality. So how do you clarify to your young people or maybe to other professionals that you are friendly and that you build sort of a reciprocal mutual relationship with a young person, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're their friend. The reality is that you're still getting paid. So anyway, we'll talk more about that. I don't know why I'm like going into it right now. We'll talk about some friendly engagement techniques. We'll also talk about therapizing versus emotional support. So another area where I think folks often get real confused is they're like, oh, a peer support specialist is kind of like a therapist, right? And it's like, no, but there is sort of that emotional support aspect to it. And then we'll wrap up. So this is our second session, so we'll do introductions again if folks are cool with that. So my name is Caitlin. I'm a project manager and trainer with Pathways Research and Training Center, and I have done lots of work as a peer support specialist and as a supervisor for peer support specialists, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
So I'm Mary Beth again. I'm a peer support training specialist. I use my lived experience as a young adult in multiple systems, including special education, foster care, the main one, mental health. Sorry about that brain freeze for a second. And then also I've used that experience to be a peer support specialist, and then now I use that experience to train peer support specialists. And my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Is it okay if we have folks introduce themselves either over the phone or via chat, or how, whatever your preference would be?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, hi, I'm Catherine McCarthy. I'm a youth partner at Center for Human Services, and I serve Snohomish County in Washington.
Awesome. Thank you, Catherine.
No problem.
Hi, can you hear me as well?
Yep.
My name's Erin. I'm the program coordinator for the Living Room. We work with LGBTQ youth in Clackamas County, and I use they, them pronouns.
Awesome. Thanks, Erin.
I am Julianne Gale. I work in Mason County for Community Youth Services Transitional Age Youth Program as a youth engagement specialist, and my pronouns are she or they.
Awesome. Thank you, Julianne.
Hi. My name is Ashley Monroe. I work at Passages in Spokane County, and I work as a youth peer specialist within WISE, or Wraparound Services. And I'm really excited. I really enjoyed our last webinar, and I'm excited for this one, especially since I am in school pursuing a master's degree right now, and so I think it's really helpful for me to understand the differences between peer support and therapy, since I'm kind of learning one and then have been doing peer support for the last 3 years. So I'm just really excited for this webinar, and I really appreciate that you guys are putting it on.
Oh, yay. Thank you.
So we've got some chat.
It looks like, Ashley Pennock came in on the chat, said, "Hi, I'm Ashley. I work as a youth partner in Spokane County at Passages Family Support." Awesome. Thanks, Ashley. Okay, is that everybody?
No. Sorry, I'm Katiana Johnston. Catherine McCarthy and I are sharing laptop right now for this. But we both work as youth partners for the Center for Human Services wraparound team in Snohomish.
Awesome. So lots of RAP folks here today, too. That's awesome. Cool. Well, thank you, everybody, for taking the time to introduce yourselves. I just think, as we've talked about before, one of our goals with the communities of practice is this isn't just like about us doing little webinars and talking at you the whole time. It's so that we can all kind of get to know each other and create some community for peer support specialists in our particular region. Because I know that we talked about this last time, it can be really isolating in your role. So I'm just hoping that, again, we can have a lot of really rich discussions today. Please, if there's ever anything that you want to add, like, interrupt us, I hope that through these we can really just build kind of some stronger ties with each other when things are coming up. Obviously, we don't want to share PHI, but maybe people can bounce ideas off of each other, things like that. And PHI being protected health information. Sorry, y'all, I know better than to use acronyms. And thank you, Julianne. Yeah, Mason County, Washington. I think that there are probably a couple of Mason counties in our region. So our learning objectives today, again, we'll talk about clarifying your role, supporting youth that you work with in ways that feel like conversational and not telling them what to do, and then maintaining boundaries. But first, we'll start off with a little bit of a discussion. So if folks don't mind sharing, what are some things, maybe like during your first meeting, what are some boundaries that you set right from the start? And when you set those boundaries, how does that incorporate into your first meeting? So basically, like, what are you telling youth and their families your specific parameters or boundaries are?
This is Julianne, and usually, because I work with older youth, usually I ask them if they've had a peer counselor before or if they've had a youth partner, if they've done WISE. And then I ask them what they remember about that and what they liked and didn't like about it. And then I let them know that, I only answer my phone when I'm working, which is generally weekdays, Monday through Friday. And I let them know other support because I don't do any of the crisis stuff. And I let them know that I'm there to support their goals, and that my job is based on shared lived experience. And I explain I don't just use that phrase, I explain what that is and ask them if they know what mandated reporting is. And then even if they do know what it is, just clarifying like when the things are confidential and when they're not, so that they can make their own choices about what they want to share with me or not. Those are some of the things that I do.
I love it. I love a couple of things about that. Number one, I was super bad at setting boundaries around my phone. Like, I actually had some experiences where I kind of had to like go back and tell you like, hey, I know that I've picked up the 3 a.m. calls before, but like, I can't do that anymore. So I love that you do that at your first meeting. I also really appreciate that you said that you ask if they know some of these things already, rather than, I think, youth oftentimes get kind of lectured to about what some of this stuff is. So I love that you come in and you're kind of like, hey, like, have you heard about mandatory reporting? But obviously that's a really good one to set from the start too. Yeah, thanks for sharing, Julianne. I think that those are some really good boundaries to set, particularly starting at your first meeting. Are there other ones that folks want to share?
I just want to share that I think from trial and error, I have definitely learned that when I'm working with younger youth or youth, about 17 and younger. I know it depends on the situation, but if they want their parents involved and their parents are involved, then I make sure I have a discussion with them and hopefully with the youth present so that the parent is aware of the boundaries, and that, because I know there can be some confliction of like, I want this for my child, but then the youth is the person I'm working with and I need to respect what their goals are. And so I try to have those open discussions and just say like, if things come up, please talk to me. But I know trial and error, it's very important to include the parent if you're going to be working with them. I've gotten off on the wrong foot before, and then it looks like the youth and I are working against them rather than all of us working collectively.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Ashley. I think that that's a super important one is when we're setting boundaries, we're not just doing it with the youth that we work with, right? We're doing it with the parents too. And I know that I've had experiences where I've had to set boundaries with team members where I'm like, hey, like that's actually not a part of my role, but thanks. So yeah, I think that especially during that first meeting, having the parent there so that everybody's on the same page. And I think it kind of helps build trust with the parent too. So yeah, that's a really good thing to mention. Thanks, Ashley.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
That's not something that we practice in our agency because we work with 15 to 24. And some of the youth don't want their parents involved at all. But if they do want their parents involved, then we have a family engagement specialist who is a family partner instead. And so while we'll all be together at WISE meetings, wraparound meetings, I don't know that I would have permission to go meet with the family unless the youth said that's what I want to do.
Totally. And I think that that's something that's really important to remember is it's up to the young person. I know that for me, when I was doing peer support as a wraparound youth partner, the first meeting that we would have when a young person was referred to wraparound would be with the youth partner, the family partner, and the care coordinator. So we would sort of all go and explain what our roles were. But then for me within my agency also, the first meeting that I would have with a youth, if their family was involved in the wraparound process and they were living with their family, is that I would go and meet with them and their parent or their guardian for my first meeting to just kind of explain what my role is. But there were definitely times where I was working with young people who had a different sort of living arrangement and their family wouldn't be present for our first meeting, in which case we would have to sort of have like a separate conversation about what my role would be, and the youth would help determine what that would look like. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Julianne, because I think, yeah, not every young person is going to have the same situation where their family or their guardian is going to be present. And it's important to let the young person either choose what that's going to look like when you have a conversation with their family member, or definitely be in the loop and be there when you're having that conversation with them. Are there any other things that folks think is important to mention when they're setting boundaries with their young people?
I've had to set physical, this is Katiana, by the way. I've had to set physical boundaries with a lot of my clients. I actually used to work at Compass Health with their wraparound program before I moved over here to Center for Human Services. And the culture there was very just anti-physical touch, completely. So I used to kind of set the boundary of hey, it's kind of like a joke. I can do high fives, fist bumps, or side hugs if the parent or guardian is present. But here at CHS, physical touches, they're a little more lenient with that. So just finding not only the boundary, with myself, of just setting that boundary of, hey, my physical boundaries need to be respected, but I do understand if physical touch is a really big communication tool for you. So working with them instead of just setting that hard boundary of don't touch me. but working with them and really validating their perspective on that and validating their needs while also teaching them what healthy boundaries look like between two individuals.
Yeah, I think that that's a super important one, and it kind of helps young people, you sort of mentioned this, like build some of those social skills and self-determination skills around like what is like kind of cool and appropriate physical touch, you know? I had a similar situation one time where I had a young person who like always wanted to hold my hand, and I had to sort of gently tell them like, hey, totally understand that that's like a thing for you and that you have like other people in your life that you do that with, but it's kind of uncomfortable for me, you know? And they weren't offended. It was a little bit of a learning moment for them where they were like, oh, cool, like not everybody has the same parameters around what's comfortable for them with physical touch. Yeah, and I think that that's a really important one too, especially if your agency has boundaries around that. I mean, you want to set that out right from the start. Yeah, but you're also right where you don't want to be like, don't touch me. Like, you don't want to be weird about it, right? Where the young person is like, oh, like, what's going on here? So, yeah, that's an important one. I think that something else that's important to think about, like kind of related to that boundary is if you're driving your youth around in the car, you know, like how comfortable are you being, are you feeling like one-on-one with the young person and for what period of time? I know that when I was a supervisor, worked with a lot of youth partners because it's kind of an unavoidable part of the job sometimes around like, okay, well, what are your personal boundaries with like riding alone with this young person or young people in general? So those are important things to kind of figure out for yourself too. Are there any other boundaries that people set from the start that they feel like are worth mentioning?
I just wanted to add that I also tend to review like the legal part of like at age 13. Sometimes I do work with youth that are around 12 or sometimes even 11. Just depends on case by case and what the family and the youth have decided they need. But I try to make sure that everyone is aware that when you are age 13, like I am here to serve the youth and I have to respect their legal rights at age 13, even if the family, caregiver, etc. does not agree with their decisions, which may include discharging.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's an important boundary to set from the start, and that's something when I know during my first meeting, I would explain that to the young person and to the parent as well, just about like my legal responsibility is to help the young person enact like what their goals are in terms of their treatment. And in Oregon, it's age 14, so you know that would be the one difference. Is I'd be like, yeah. At age 14, like legally, these are the things that they are allowed to pursue, and like it's my role to help them do that, and not to like, yeah, manipulate them or convince them to do something else. So I think that that's a super important one, Ashley. Thanks for bringing that up. Go ahead.
Another thing that I bring up, and I do this after making the mistake of not bringing it up early enough, is letting them know that if I see them in public, you know, for their protection and because of like legal requirements on me, I'm not going to acknowledge them unless they acknowledge me first. I work in a small rural county. I see the people I work with all the time around. And so that's like a really big one. And I realized that I need to also say it in the WISE meetings, not just when I'm meeting with the youth, because I had a situation where someone from the WISE team saw me in public, but they were with the youth. And they were with the youth, and I couldn't really acknowledge them since the youth wasn't consenting to that conversation. It was the outside person who was consenting to the acknowledgement. And so at our next meeting, I had to explain what that was about. But for a while, they just thought I was really rude and weird.
No, I think that that's a super good point, and that's an easy one to forget too.
Yeah.
Is like making sure that you're clarifying that not just with the youth but with their team. I think something else that I used to do was I would ask the young person, like, if we run into somebody that when we're together, how do you want, like,
To identify.
how do you want me to be identified? Like, I had some young people who were like, oh, I'm just going to say that you're, like, my older sister, or I'm just going to say that you're a mentor, or whatever it might be. But, yeah, because the community that I worked in, one of them is, like, a rural community that's sort of outside of Portland, and so I would be with the young person, and we would run into, like, folks that they know all the time, So I think that those are super important boundaries to set.
For me, I was, one of the young people that I was working with was, like, opening a bank account, and so we went to the bank, and we were, quote-unquote, roommates, and that was just kind of the, like, we're roommates, and I'm here with her looking at, because I've opened a bank account before, and so it totally worked out, but, like, we weren't always roommates. It was just that situation that we were roommates, and really, I liked that it was, like, fluid.
Mm-hmm.
You can kind of change your role together depending on what you need to do.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that these are all some really good points and, like, honestly, things that we probably would have covered had they not been brought up anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And I really appreciate just, like, everybody sharing and then the rich discussion around it. I think something else that I'd like to highlight is that when you're setting boundaries, it's okay for them to change a little bit, too, I mean, obviously, some things will be static, like, your role will always be your role. Like, your legal obligations will always be your legal obligations. But I think it's okay to normalize with the young person that sometimes maybe, like, the way that you feel about how you're going to be answering your phone, or, like, how accessible you can be, or what conversations you can be comfortable with, like, might be fluid and might change.
Well, or even like you mentioned, like touch levels kind of
Mm-hmm.
stuff. Like maybe one day you're not feeling into having a side hug, and that's okay
Right.
too. You can suggest a high five or whatever.
Yeah, you can be like, high fives instead, please. But obviously the key things when you're definitely setting boundaries, and y'all already know this, so this was definitely brought up, is just highlighting some of the things that are definitely legal requirements, like mandatory reporting, what it is that you have to, like legally what your job is. I think it was Ashley who brought this up about once the young person is of a certain age, they are able to have some legal autonomy over their treatment care and planning. So things of that nature are super important to just share right off the bat. And I don't think it hurts to, like, remind people of those things. Usually I find it was people who were not the youth who would sometimes forget them, so just making sure that you kind of have, like, your elevator speech set up for that, I think, is super important.
So this next part is about boundary setting around friendship versus peerness. So I use a term often when I'm talking about being a peer, and that term is friendly, not friends. So that can sound kind of harsh because, or I think that it can sound kind of harsh because you want to be friends with people, but that's not necessarily your role because you are a paid professional in the young person that you're working with in their life. So you do use your peerness. We talked about this last time where there is that, like, understanding of youth culture. You might have similar interests. There's a level of shared understanding there, and you try to maintain a mutual, which is like hierarchical relationship with the young person. Young people probably share things with you that they don't necessarily share with other adults because there is that shared understanding. There might be blurred lines sometimes, especially if they're not socially connected. So it's important to kind of think about what can be done when those lines get blurred. How do you maintain those boundaries or remind of them? Can I do that? Is it, Erin?
Oh, totally.
So for this first scenario, imagine a youth tells you that you're their best friend. What would you do in that situation?
Or maybe this has happened to you. Like, I know that I had this happen with a couple of youth, and it's a kind of a delicate situation, you know, sometimes having to approach it with, like, how do I acknowledge and normalize their feelings around this while also making sure that they understand, like, I may be here to help them find some friendships, but, you know, I can't be, there are certain things that are a part of my role that, like, wouldn't fall under the friendship realm, you know? Anyway, so maybe this has happened to you before. It looks like, yeah, I love it, Julianne. So Julianne said maybe ask them what they mean by best friend. I think always using open-ended questions to get some clarity from young people is a really good idea. Yeah, and it can kind of start a conversation, too, about, like, what do they value in friendship, you know, and it help you do your role in terms of connecting them to some community resources.
I think also I would like acknowledge the value in that statement because that obviously means I've built a lot of rapport with whatever client this is. But this would be like a good opportunity to identify some other natural supports in the youth life that could be a long-term best friend, quote unquote, because I'm not going to be there in a year. And I would take that opportunity to remind the youth that this is a stabilization like tactic and it's not going to be forever.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's super important. And I love that you're like, reflect on like the value of that statement. And then also remind them like, well, I'm not going to be able to be around like forever. So let's work on identifying some other natural supports. And I think that approaching it in that way can feel super supportive and also can it like show the youth that you value the relationship that you guys have too, even if you don't define it as a best friend. Is there anything else that folks would want to share, or like maybe folks have had similar situations pop up for them?
The situation that I had was when I came on board, there were a bunch of youth that had had a youth partner before, and one of them told me that she couldn't wait for the 2-year legal limit to run out so she could be friends with the last youth partner. And so that gave me a picture of like how careful you have to be in terms of maintaining good boundaries, or at least what I would have to do with that youth, even though I didn't necessarily clearly know what to do. I just knew it was something I'd have to pay a lot of attention to in this case.
So maybe not necessarily relying strictly on there's a legal limit of us, but more on building that relationship, building those relationships with the young person in their natural supports.
Yeah, totally. And helping them identify some community supports too. Because what can happen in those situations sometimes is the young person relies on this relationship and then they don't go and seek some of those other like natural community supports that are out there, which not that it's ever the intention, but that can actually be kind of harmful to the youth, right? Yeah, so we want to be really particular about that too. All right, and it looks like we have a couple of chats. Yes, Savannah mentioned like setting those healthy boundaries. I think that that's important to, remind the young person about what your boundaries are when things like this come up, right? Especially since it's things that you've likely already gone over before in your first meeting. It's not news to them. Just having that gentle reminder, reflection can always be pretty helpful. Ashley shared, I've also shared my experience with having strong connections with my formal supports and how I maintain boundaries in that situation.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good strategy of sharing, like,
your
Yeah.
own experience.
Yeah, totally. Like, and hear how I value some of those relationships, you know, and maybe also here's how they look different.
I think that gives really good context.
Yeah, absolutely. So we just have a couple of strategies that we mentioned here, but again, I think that these have already been mentioned by our very smart group. So acknowledge and help them brainstorm. I'm glad to hear that you like kicking it. I really like spending time with you too. I won't be able to work with you forever though. So what would you like to do in the meantime to meet more people? Make sure that you're reflecting on it and like that you're finding the value in it too. I hear you and appreciate our relationship, but I also have to do some things like friends don't, like reporting and junk. You've mentioned in the past that Rachel's your best friend. How's she doing? So I think like using some of those reflections on what you might know about their life, their natural supports already, and seeing this not as something that's like scary, but as an opportunity is always really nice.
So this is, again, pulled from our last presentation where we went over this a little bit, but just a reminder again, like, sometimes it's easy to be like, okay, I know what not to do, but not necessarily the why. So it's just a reminder that it's important to help the young person build their support network so that when you're not working together anymore, they don't have a hole. They don't put all of their like friendship eggs in the basket that is you two working together.
Friendship eggs and peer support basket.
There we go. And that's the relationship building part as well. So this part's about some friendly engagement techniques. One of the main things that I talked a lot about with peers is the difference between how you talk with friends and how you talk with the young people you're working with. So with friends, it's a very mutual relationship. So you can make suggestions, you can be kind of leading, give opinions of, I really think you should do this thing,
yeah.
Or why aren't you working on this? Or, you know,
like you can tell friends when they're being stupid.
Right.
Like if I have a friend who's like doing something that's like weird, I'm like, hey, like, don't do that. Yeah, you know. Whereas you can't do that with a young person.
Yeah.
Right.
So using a lot of open-ended questions helps keep the young person's ideas and values front and center without accidentally placing your own values into their ideas. Reflections can help the young person you're working with gather and articulate their own thoughts, and affirmations help validate their experiences and goals for their futures. So focusing a lot on open-ended questions, reflections, and affirmations can help guide you in the way you work with the young people without accidentally leading them in any one direction. So it helps you kind of keep them doing what they want to do.
Yeah, making sure that we're not like telling them what to do. It looks like we've got some good stuff in the chat box here too. So yeah, again, Ashley, really stellar idea, sharing your own experience. Savannah mentioned that they also like to talk about how when I shared is used as a tool and that you're not a forever person. I think that that's an important one to hit on is like, hey, value our relationship and like, I'm only going to be around as long as the process or whatever.
That's also something good to go over in the first meeting as well. I don't think we mentioned that, but kind of really outlining your time that you're working together from what you know from the get-go and referencing it often. So not necessarily being like, okay, now that we've met today, we have 13 more meetings. but as it comes up naturally, kind of being like, all right, so building in these community support. So you're not doing like anything behind the scenes or like cloak and dagger or whatever. You're really, really upfront around, we're not going to be working together forever. So let's work on getting forever people around you.
Totally. Something that Ashley mentioned too is, with friends, you're trying to get your own needs met. Yeah, with friends, it's okay to like, you know, I can sit down with Mary Beth and be like, all right, girl, like I had a depression day yesterday. Let's talk about that, you know. Whereas if you're doing that with your young person, that's not okay. Like you don't want to put your needs on them. their needs are always the focus in the work that we do. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't see value in mutuality and that you're not allowed to get something out of the relationship. But yeah, the relationship shouldn't be working on you. Whereas with friends, you can you have the ability to like take some of that space.
Yeah. And totally, you want to work yourself out of a job.
Yeah. That's why we're all here, right? So connecting that to the video, I know that we sent you guys sort of like a little video exercise that had a peer support specialist working with the youth. So did you notice any specific like engagement techniques that were being used by that person that were maybe friendly but still working to help the young person work on stuff? And if people are like, I didn't do the video or I forgot about it or whatever, that's totally fine. It's honestly just there to be like a supplemental exercise if you guys feel like doing it. Okay, we'll move on. Cool. But I'll send it out again in our follow-up email with the recording so that you guys can take a look at it if you want. I'm pretty proud of it. I think it's super cute. And the only reason that we're not showing it here is because it has
it stops and starts.
Yeah, it stops and starts. It's like a little exercise. Erin said it seemed much more on topic than most of my conversations. Yeah, and I want to validate that. Like, I know that when I was working with youth in wraparound, sometimes we would have meetings where it was like, okay, like if they just want to talk about, like their boyfriend or whatever the whole time. But then sometimes we would have meetings where it was like, okay, like you're having a team meeting in a week, like let's talk about what you might want to bring up, let's talk about this. So I think it all depends on the context. And Erin, if I remember correctly, you're in a drop-in center, right? So sometimes I think that can be a little bit different.
Yeah.
Can definitely be a little bit more free-flowing.
Yeah, we do drop in. We also do some like one-on-one stuff, and youth leadership, where it's a little bit smaller groups and things like that. But yeah, I feel like what I've noticed is that there's kind of a need to like let the conversation go, but then also be able to pull it back. Because if you're just like, no, we're doing this and we're only doing this, you're likely to just like lose engagement and interest. But if you're able to kind of be like, oh yeah, that is ridiculous, and now we're focusing back on this, like it kind of helps that become a little bit easier.
Totally. Very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, that's something that we talk about a lot when we're like working with other peers and doing training, is how we call it guiding while keeping it on track. Yeah. And what it is like if you're there and you're being way too stringent, like that's probably not super fun for you, and it's definitely not fun for the young person. Like, have side conversations, do those things, and then you can bring it back around.
Well, and that's not how you get to like the meat of stuff. Like, you have to have that conversation to kind of learn what actually matters to the young person.
Yeah.
Instead of just being like, tell me what you want to do with your life.
Absolutely. Okay, so the next piece that we'll talk about a little bit, moving from how you set that boundary around like being friendly but not necessarily being their friend, is therapizing versus emotional support. So youth are receiving emotional support from multiple avenues, and this can include both peers and therapists, right? Like, my therapist is definitely an emotional support. I don't know about you all, but like when I reach out to my therapist, if she doesn't text me back, I'm like, what did I do? Like, don't be mad at me, But I also recognize that I think it was mentioned by Ashley earlier, like when I go into my therapist's office, it's not like she's sitting down and she's like, oh, Caitlin, here's some shit. Like, I'm getting my needs met, and it's like, she's there to help me do that. And I also recognize, like, it's probably not super appropriate to, like, go to happy hour or whatever later, Yeah. Anyway, all of that to say is, like, while you can be getting emotional support from a clinician or a therapist or another professional, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a friendship. And additionally, emotional support can look very different and have like many different faces. So where this ties in with peer support is peer support specialists obviously provide lots of emotional support to the youth, but they're also paid professionals. And it can be a little confusing, I think, for the young person and their team around what the role is. So this is probably also one of those things where setting up those boundaries in the very beginning is super helpful, where you're like, you know, I'm here to use some of my own lived experience and shared understanding in order to help you get what you want. I'll be able to help you work with professionals on your team, but maybe even saying stuff like I've had youth ask me, like, so are you kind of like a therapist? And I'll just kind of like squash that in the beginning. I'm like, nope, you know, like your therapist is going to help make clinical recommendations and help you with some treatment planning stuff. And you're more than welcome to bounce ideas off of me, but like that's a totally different role. I think that, you know, in American society today or whatever, we see therapists as like the professional providers of emotional support, which is why those lines get blurred sometimes. And I think even therapists have to clarify their role of like, hey, I'm not here to like be your emotional support or like, you know, be here forever. These are kind of my parameters. So when there's some role confusion, I think it's important to keep a couple of things in mind. Again, everyone's providing emotional support, and I think that that's good to mention, but it's coming through different avenues. So sometimes when this would come up for me with young people, I would be like, well, I understand where you kind of think I might be like a therapist, but, you know, some things that therapists don't do is they don't really share their lived experience a lot. I'm here to help you and like share some of my lived experience. I'm totally happy to help brainstorm some ideas around treatment planning or tell you maybe things that have worked for me, but like specific recommendations, things like that, that's coming from your therapist.
Looks like there's some comments.
Ooh, and we have a chat in the chat box. Yeah, and Ashley said, because we're seen as counselors and support so often, I'm called or introduced as a therapist. So I also talk about this often, try to define the difference, but it's really hard because the roles have some similarities. Yeah, I think it's hard too. And like, so and team members would often get confused, and so would parents. And so often what I would do is I would be like, I totally understand, like, where there's some confusion. I could normalize and acknowledge that and be like, but therapists have clinical backgrounds and might be offering specific recommendations on those things, and I just need to clarify that, like, I'm not here as a clinician. I'm here more as somebody to help the youth, like, brainstorm and weigh their options, and that might play into their treatment plans, but, again, not a clinician.
Kind of like, I'm not here with opinions. I'm here to help the young person share their opinions.
Right. Like, and therapy, I think, you know, sometimes rightfully so, is a little bit more leading. Like we were just talking about, how do you have a conversation, use some of these open-ended questions, reflections, and these techniques to help the youth decide what they want to do. I mean, sometimes I still do those. I go into my therapist, I'm like, hey, I need you to tell me what to do. And I think that there's a little bit more leeway to do that depending on what the situation is. So we have a second scenario here. So say a youth wants to change their medication and is looking for recommendations on what to do. What are some steps that you can take without falling into a therapist role? Or maybe something has happened with you guys where, like, clearly the youth was asking for something that seemed a little bit more clinical, and you were like, ooh, let's back up, you know? Yeah, does anybody have a situation like that or feel like they have recommendations if something like this were to pop up for them?
This happens fairly frequently for me, and I let them know of the resources that we have as part of our program, which is like a consultant psychiatrist, and also that they can talk about it with their therapist. And then sometimes I support them in that communication, whether it's like, texting to therapists to let them know that they want to set up an appointment with the psych provider, or, talking through what their questions are so that they're prepared for that kind of meeting, or talking through what they want to say. And I know other people in my position at my agency have sat in on those meetings with the psych provider, although I have not yet done that.
So it sounds like kind of helping them prepare for it and like access the resource without being the resource yourself.
Exactly. And also letting them know explicitly, like, that's not part of my job, but we do provide those services as an organization, and here's how you can reach them.
Yeah, perfect. So making sure that they're still, getting the resource too. I think that's a really good recommendation, Julianne. And it looks like Savannah chatted in, and Savannah said using personal experience and motivational questions. Yeah,
I would love that too, I think.
I think that that's a really good one. And like, maybe you can share a little bit about like if you have had that personal experience, like what was it that you did? And I also like, Julianne, you mentioned redirecting them back to like their therapist, helping them prep for that. I think that's great. Ashley mentioned sometimes I call myself a coach or mentor because most people don't define their therapist in this way, and it helps clarify some differences. I'd love to hear other thoughts on this. I've definitely had situations before where if there's I think some pretty significant confusion on what a peer support specialist does versus a therapist. And I've had youth ask me, they're like, so you're kind of like a mentor. And I'm like, yeah, sort of, only I'm not here to tell you what to do. So I actually think that that's a perfectly fine way to help, contextualize it a little bit for people, because people are like, peer support specialist, what the heck is that? Yeah, and I think that moving it away from that therapist role is pretty important, because it's important for people to understand that you're not there to make clinical recommendations. I think that using terms like coach or mentor or things that are a little bit more familiar to people, but then contextualizing that, it can be super helpful, Yeah, exactly. I tell the youth that you're driving the bus and I'm in the back seat. Yeah, exactly. I think that that's a really good analogy. Okay, so do folks have any other recommendations on what they would do if stuff like this comes up?
I just want to say that I frequently work with medication providers, and I often, like, the therapist will say, hey, they're talking about this. Can you help them set up that appointment? And so I work as kind of like, I bridge them to those providers and then go to the appointment with them as needed. But it's interesting because I know with our therapist, there's not a lot of discussion about medications. And so that's just not really something that the therapists at our agency do, but I help link them to the provider since I usually attend appointments with them, or I help them figure out barriers to transportation to the appointment and things like that. So I just thought, I was a little confused because our therapists don't do that as often. So it was a little different for me.
Yeah, totally. Well, and I think even in other situations where maybe if the youth is asking, maybe it's not like a question around medication, but something else that might be
what to do in a difficult situation.
Right, like related to a clinical need, right? So I know that I've had lots of youth who were experiencing suicidal ideation, and it's that's totally something that I'm happy to talk to you about, and that I can help provide some guidance and some shared understanding and shared experience with. And I want to make sure that you're connecting to the appropriate clinical resources that you might need for that.
So you're not the front line of that.
Yeah. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Ashley, because I've worked with multiple agencies. Ones where therapists worked very closely and had psychiatric nurse practitioners within their office, and then other ones where they were like, I don't really do that piece. But I think that there are other pieces too, particularly just related to crisis and extreme mental health situations where Are you there to provide some support? Absolutely. And then acting as that bridge to the other resource that's like more clinical is super important. And that might be a situation too where you're kind of stepping out of the be super open and have you make all the decisions role into something that might be a little bit more leading, like, hey, what I'm hearing is that you could probably really use a therapist or some clinical support, or this is something that you might want to talk to your therapist about if you're broaching some of those crisis situations. And it sounds like we have some stuff in the chat. So Julianne mentioned, to clarify, our therapists set up the appointments with the psych providers and usually go with the youth to telemedicine appointments. That's why I bring them in as a resource. Yeah, totally. Yeah, it is really funny. I appreciate that you mentioned that, Ashley. Like, agency to agency, it looks super different, not just for peer supports, but I think for a lot of people. Like, I've sometimes met care coordinators where I'm like, oh, like, what are you doing? Because that's my job, Yeah, I think, obviously agency context is super important with all of this, Ashley. Yes, yeah. I don't know if you should, sorry, this is like a huge digression, but I had a youth once text me, and they're like, the care coordinator is driving me to this appointment, and they started telling me about, like, their experience as a teenager, and did it mean that I just, like, don't care? I was like, I mean, you're allowed to feel how you feel. I don't know why they're talking to you about that, though. Anyway, yeah, I want to be mindful of time. But so some of the recommendations, and again, a lot of these have come up, is offer some shared experience and understanding, using open-ended questions to help the young person brainstorm, and then helping them make a plan to connect with their therapist or another resource in order to meet their need. So again, and we mentioned some of these last time, and it sent it in the document that you guys have, but it's, not your role to be their therapist, even though you're there to provide emotional support and walk them through difficult situations. A lot of the times you're just more of that link. And it related to some of that emotional support is normalizing some of their feelings or maybe some of the situations that they're going through, destigmatizing a lot of that mental health, and then offering affirmation. So I think we've kind of discussed this, and I want to make sure that we have time for our wrap-up discussion. But if there's anything that folks want to add, like, are there other situations where you feel like you need to clarify your boundaries and would like to do some brainstorming around that?
I needed to say, I was going to wait, but then I thought I need to say this. With working in WISE, it's frequent that, I guess it's not too often, but sometimes a parent will call me and they'll be like, oh, well, you're a member on the WISE team, so you can support me. And once a parent is kind of in the thick of it, and it's like, great, this is perfect opportunity for you to talk to your parent peer, but they're like, but they're not available. And I'm like, well, this isn't really my role. So I'd love to hear anyone else's experiences with that, because it's happened even as when I work with a youth in a different role and their parent had a therapist at our agency, they called me for support thinking I was kind of the same person.
Oh, girl. Well, I've definitely been there, but I'm interested to hear, if folks have other experiences like that and what they did. Oh, the crossover when a YP is being used as a family partner, so they're supposed to support the parent too. It's something that Savannah asked about. Yeah, well, I guess I sort of have a clarifying question, but having done some training in different communities, I have seen that sometimes communities will use youth partners or family partners in the same role. So they'll be like, oh, this youth partner is also a family partner for like the same family. So I just want to say, as somebody who's like gone and done trainings, when I see that, it's usually, and I'm sorry if this is happening in your agency, but that's like a hard no from me. I'm like, oh, cool, I see what you're doing, and stop. Yeah, Savannah, oh, that's so hard. If you'd like, something that we do as a part of these communities of practice is we have like separate calls and TA time. I would be more than happy to do that with you because I know that that can be really hard to set those boundaries, and I think a lot of it is how do you help your organization like make these realizations that not only is that super confusing for you, but it's super confusing for the youth and the family, and ultimately is kind of
It's a conflict of interest.
yeah, especially if you're doing wraparound. Yeah, so I will email you after this and we can set up a call. Like,
Can I say something about that real quick?
yeah, sure.
I think one of the challenges in Washington state that sets agencies up to do things like that is the legal requirement is that WISE teams need a youth partner or a family partner, but both are not required. And so that sets us up to be looked at like we're interchangeable. Luckily, my agency doesn't do things that way, but it seems like that would be a common thing given the law.
Yeah. And, you know, we've actually had very similar experiences in Oregon, too, where, for our wraparound policy, it says almost the same thing, where it's like wraparound teams should have a youth or family partner. And what ends up happening, because there are some pretty clear boundaries still on what those mean, but I've definitely been on teams before where, you know, mom didn't have a family partner, and so was reaching out to me when she needed support. And it was hard to set those boundaries and say, like, hey, you know, mom, I mean, I didn't call her mom, obviously, but to tell her, like, I hear what you're saying, I can totally understand your feelings, and
I'm here for the young person.
yeah, like, my role is to make sure that I'm helping the young person achieve their goals. So I recommend that you talk to, you know, the care coordinator about getting a family partner, or like whatever it might be. And it can be hard because you don't want to damage those relationships with the parents too, because they do have some influence on how you're able to work with the young person. It looks like we've got some good stuff coming in the chat.
There's some more above it.
Yeah. I had a similar experience, Ashley, when you say that you were working in a peer organization. I worked in a peer organization too, so when stuff like that would happen, I had a lot more support being like, nope, you know, which you don't always have if you're a peer that's in a non-peer organization. And then Julianne mentions when there's no caregiver, mom, dad, or youth over age of consent doesn't want them involved, there wouldn't be a need for both. Yeah, absolutely. But most of the time, I think if there's a parent on the team and there's a youth on the team, they should both get a youth and family partner. And it stretches you thin, your contact doesn't support that. I think also something that comes up, Savannah, is it just causes a lot of confusion and almost similar burnout for the young person and the family. Oh yeah, we experienced the same billing issues in Oregon, Ashley. I wish I could fix that. We actually just passed a new administrative rule. Maybe when it comes out, I can send it to you guys once it gets put out there. But it's and I don't know when it'll actually be enacted in the billing systems, but they have to now have Medicaid billable access for both youth support and family support. Nice. So I'll let you know how that goes. Well, yeah, they haven't started doing it yet, so we'll see how it goes. But I'll let you know. Yeah, we're used as an ad or a fourth person. Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the times that some of the barriers that we face are definitely ones that are organizational and structural. And if folks would like just some extra support, I mean, I can't change your organizations, but I do know some of the people who are doing the WISE trainings in Washington. I can try and help with some communication on how to stay true to your role. So I know that we're a little over time, so I'm wondering, just kind of like we did last time, what are some things that you guys would hope that we can cover next time? And is there anything else that you have, like any big questions about or takeaways from today, anything like that?
My biggest takeaway was the little therapizing versus emotional support diagram and some practice language, like in response to the youth tells you your best friend, and the I'm not here to share my opinions, I'm here to help the young person share their opinions.
Awesome.
And for next time, or I don't know about next time, but at some point, I would just love to hear about like different models of peer organizing, like how like peer respites or peer-led organizations function and how they were able to be created and that kind of thing.
Ooh, I like that. Yeah, kind of like not just what are the different models, but it sounds like almost like a little bit of history on like how did they get started.
Yeah, or also like different agencies, how they handle unionization or stuff like that, like just organizing things. And then I'm also curious, I don't know if this is outside the scope of what we're doing together, but to look at how is climate change impacting our work and what do we do about that?
Ooh, I like that too. I'll be honest, I think that these are all great topics. They're not necessarily like in my realm of expertise, but I think that if we could hold like maybe one of these communities of practice where we all come together and kind of like discuss what we think these impacts are, that would be really cool. So definitely in my area of interest.
Yeah.
You know?
That would be great.
Awesome. Are there any other like topics that folks would like to focus on?
I feel like I'm probably beating a dead horse here, but I've been in my role for 3 years and as a youth peer, but different programs. And it's still, I think because I'm in a peer-based organization, and we started as just peer support, and then we added on the primary services and therapy, that it still can be really confusing, I think, within my agency to define what is the clear difference between a therapist and a peer specialist. Like there's some pretty obvious things, but then it's so gray, other than saying I don't do these specific evidence-based practice. I do not discuss trauma, other than like how can we share this with your therapist, or connecting them. But I think I just like to keep going over that and other people's experiences, so that's kind of helpful for me.
Totally. I think that actually this is something that we should revisit regularly and kind of check in about like what strategies are helpful for folks when they're setting those boundaries and clarifying their role, and like maybe even talking with I'm putting this as like homework for me, but talking with therapists on like what does their elevator speech look like and where's some of the crossovers so that we can clarify, because I think that it is something where regardless of setting your boundaries and like being pretty clear about what it is you do and don't do, there can be some confusion about where young people, who they can access, where they can go, when they need a certain need met.
I think for me, I would really love to have a conversation around how to talk to supervisors and to better explain the like nuances of the youth partner role. I'm facing a lot of pushback around those nuances and how like parent partners and youth partners are all CPCs. And so it keeps being said that, oh, we do the same thing when I'm assigned to families and being told that I need to also work with the parent, but parent partners are not also being assigned to youth partners or to youth. So that means that I now don't have I don't have one client, I have 2 or 3 or 4 people that I need to meet with. And so trying to explain to my supervisor that there's like a nuance and a difference is really hard when my organization is trying to make steps go forward, but also taking like 3 steps back and is now telling me to do, quote unquote, the same thing that everybody else is doing when it's really not.
So it sounds like 2 things, kind of being able to communicate like what are the differences in the role, and then also, yeah, how do you have like some of that collaborative communication, I guess, with supervisors around like gently informing them that this actually isn't a part of best practice. And that might be something to loop in if your agencies haven't done like the WISE trainings or things, that might be something to loop some of those resources into, which I can definitely look into for you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And also like how to have that conversation, like you said, to gently have that conversation with a supervisor. But I've had that conversation several times, and with me, I'm standing on my soapbox, and I'm the only one on my soapbox. So how to like do it in a leader way that is speaking their language, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And like how
clear next steps.
Yeah, and like getting them to see like the importance of it sounds like.
I just want to add to that I struggle with some similar stuff. And I really love that Savannah brought that up with supervisors, because in my role, I have a higher caseload than the other members on my WISE team. And I work within 3 WISE teams, and I think I'm trying to advocate that like I need such and such supports, and it's just being shot down. But then I'm expected to do so much, and it's acted like I'm not working as hard, but yet I have the highest productivity and I have the most clients.
I've seen that happen a lot in different communities with youth partners. Like you'll go in and see that they have the highest productivity, they're meeting with people the most, they easily meet with people more than other team members do, even the care coordinator, and then they're asked to do a lot more. So I think
usually get paid less.
So I think doing some of that communication on like we can work on like how can you guys advocate for these things, but I think additionally we're holding communities of practice for supervisors, which to be totally transparent are not as well attended.
Yeah.
But I think that we can definitely bring some of those situations up and those too. Like, how do you support your staff members to do their best work and avoid burnout? And a part of it is like A, being very clear about the role, and B, being able to make sure that like they aren't just getting dumped on with every single extra thing. Yeah. Which, I'm sorry if this is like a total Debbie Downer thing, but I think that often happens to peer support specialists.
Well, and I just want to say that like I hear you both saying that, and that sucks. Like,
yeah.
I'm sorry you guys are having to deal with that. I'm sorry you people are having to deal with that. Sorry.
And I'm sorry that it's I'm normalizing it a bit here, but it happens a lot. I think that there's a lot of structural change and a lot of organizational change that needs to happen, not just within like specific agencies, but in kind of the way that we value and see peer professionals in general. So those are definitely like conversations that we can keep having, and I just want to assure you guys that we'll bring them up when we do the supervisor communities of practice as well. And yes, I see Julianne. So your supervisor is on our list. Supervisors.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. They're not on this one. They don't get the invites for this one either.
Well, and they don't get the recordings for this either.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Yeah, this is private for you guys.
Is there any chance you could send the supervisor recordings to us so that we can share them with our supervisors and also know what information they're learning, or do they need privacy also?
That's a good question. Well, I know that for everybody who registered via like our registration link, the supervisors are all getting the recordings of their supervisor communities of practice. I think that that's something I would just want to run by them, like just for full transparency, but they won't. I've had a couple supervisors ask me for the youth peer recordings, and I said that I can't share them. So I just want to assure you guys that, yeah, like these are specific for you, because again, it's not just about like doing a bit of like a knowledge transfer or training. It's about like you get to openly talk freely about some of the barriers that you are having. So yeah.
That's awesome to hear how you protect us. And, you know, my supervisor is very supportive, but there's other youth peers whose supervisors aren't necessarily as supportive in the same agency. So to give them tools that they could give their supervisors, even if their supervisors aren't willing to sign up formally or anything, or like say program director or chief clinical officer, so they can have a bigger perspective, would be really great. But they might not be willing to sign up, and it might take a number of months of encouragement to look at it before they would be willing to look at them.
Yeah, definitely. Incremental, not instantaneous. All right. Well, I know that we're over time, you all, and I want to like honor that you have very busy jobs and other things to get to. So if there's anything else that you feel like we should know or be focusing on, please, please, please don't hesitate to send an email or give us a call. And our next session is going to be February 12th at 11. I'll go ahead and send reminders out to everybody. And, oh, Savannah, thank you for sending your supervisor's name. You know, that doesn't look super familiar to me. I'll double check. He should be on our list, but I'll make sure that everybody's supervisor is, getting invites to the supervisor community of practice. And, oh, he's brand new. Oh, okay. Good to know.
Do you want me to write that down?
So, yes, please. Yeah, that would be great. All right, everyone. Well, we'll see you on the 12th. And I'll, in my follow-up email, include my phone number. And if folks want to set up separate calls for any kind of TA, I definitely encourage you to do that. That's something that we can do. All right. Well, I thank everybody for participating today, and I look forward to talking to you all in February.
Bye, everyone. All right.
Okay, cool.